Good morning. Welcome to the Fall Faculty Lecture at King. This is an old tradition at King that has been a very fine way for us to interact with friends and colleagues, both faculty and student, to know what they're doing. It's been going since the 1960s. There has been an election every year of 2 students by faculty and of 2 faculty members by students. And this has exposed us to a great many things, to research projects, to life journeys, to leaps of faith, all kinds of things that people have spoken about from this pulpit in the faculty and student lecture series. So it's a good chance to hear some things from people you may have encountered in the classroom, to know what's important to them and what sorts of things they're working on. And in the case of Kevin Deford, I'm certain that will be of great interest. I have a couple of announcements before I'll introduce Kevin. One is that our next convocation will be on October 22nd. October 22nd, we will host Catherine Patterson, King's probably best-known graduate. She is the winner of 2 Newbery Awards for The Bridge to Terabithia and Jacob Have I Loved. She is the winner of 2 National Book Awards. Films have been made of at least 3 of her books, and she's going to come speak here on the 22nd. In the evening, she'll be with Kimberly Brubaker Bradley, who is another Bristol-based children's author who was a Newbery honoree a couple of years ago. That'll be on the 22nd, and then on the 29th, we will host Christina Bieber Lake to speak about Frankenstein. Also this weekend, if you're interested and around, downtown will be the Push Film Festival. And I'm announcing that because on the committee are our own Joe Strickland and Lee Jones, who have worked very hard to make that happen. Welcome. Welcome. That was quite an entrance. I appreciate that. Very subtle. So a lot of things going on, but the Push Film Festival is worth seeing, and if you are interested in that, I encourage you to talk to Joe at some point, who knows all about it. Kevin Deford came to King in 2002. He's a native of Halls, Tennessee, a town which, from my youth, had the motto "Halls has it." I'm never quite sure what that means, but whatever it is that Halls has, presumably Kevin Deford is part of that phrase. He was an undergrad at the University of Tennessee. He went to Austin Peay State for his master's degree, and he did his PhD in the psychology of perception at the University of Louisville. There he did experiments on how we perceive reality. What is it about our perception that translates best in terms of shape? In the course of that, he then came to teach at King, where, as all of us do, he became a generalist, teaching a wide array of psychological material, but along the way continuing to focus on doing some experiments. Very disturbingly to me, several years ago, one of the rooms in the basement of Bristol Hall was painted black on the inside. And this became Kevin's experiment room, and I still don't want to know what happened in there. It's still an alarming thought to me what may have gone on. I also have the occasional thought that maybe I'm an experiment too. Maybe these 14 years working together, I have just been data collection for Kevin. My first experience of Kevin was when I first arrived in 2004, and he, without any compulsion, helped me move cartload and cartload of books across the oval. We drove the little golf cart with the little trailer across the oval time after time to get books into my office. And he has remained a good friend ever since. We have gone through the vicissitudes of working in a college together. We've gone through all kinds of academic processes that he's been a great sounding board for me on. And also, strangely, he's the only person I've ever played Truth or Dare Jenga with, which is a strange thing that also may have been part of his experimentation on me. Not positive. In addition to his teaching, Kevin is active in his community. He teaches Sunday school for young families, and he is the husband to Leilani Deford. He is the father to Ellis and Ava, who are alarmingly growing up in ways that make me realize how long I've known him. He is a devoted teacher and mentor. Rarely does one walk past Kevin's office without seeing students in there working on something along the way. You are fortunate to have him. I encourage you to take courses with him and to enjoy what he has to bring us this morning. Please welcome Kevin Deford.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, and thank you for the honor of being named faculty lecturer. I am very much honored to serve you. And so every day that I come to work, it is certainly an honor to serve you. The challenge, I think, behind this particular talk is that it's kind of a free-for-all. So as I was trying to prepare something that was meaningful and said something, then it became real clear that a lot of the topics that I'm interested in are unbelievably boring. So this is only confirmed by my wife and kids, as I would say, well, I'm thinking about talking about this. And they're like, you think that's interesting? So we'll see what happens. Hopefully this will, go well. But some of the topics that I've researched in recent years have included things like reviewing syllabi. So we'll see how things go. But let's start off with a question. So I want to ask a question. How many of you, by raise of hand, how many of you like it when someone tells you you're doing something wrong? All right, a couple of hands, but not very many. And so I think that's maybe an overarching theme to the talk with respect to, when we're told we're doing something wrong. Now, I really hesitate with the whole idea of wrong because as we're talking today, then I'm going to talk a little bit about a crisis that went in, that was in psychology about 5 or 6 years ago, and it's not resolved, but it has progressed, and so I want to talk a little bit about it, and it has to do with not necessarily doing something wrong, but certainly about getting some feedback and what you do with that particular feedback. So let's move. So here we have, so if you're really bored, then I will say that there's 3 parts and there's 2 slides per part. Okay, so as you're looking up here, if you kind of doze off at some point, then you can at least look up and say, okay, he's at part 3. Good, we're about done with this. So that at least gives you a roadmap and you kind of see where we're going. We're going to start off, we're going to talk about some connections. I'm going to talk about some different studies that have drawn psychology together. And so we'll talk about a methodology in particular that has linked a lot of different areas of psychology. Then we're going to talk about some replication. We're going to talk about some feedback and what that feedback gave to psychology. Basically some red flags. And then from there, the response from getting that particular feedback. So just a passage from Proverbs, listen to advice, accept instruction, that you may gain wisdom in the future. And so that resonated to me with respect to what are you going to do with information, what are you going to do with instruction, what are you going to do. I contemplated saying what are you going to do with data, but then I was like, that's too much. So we're constantly given information, instruction, data, and this is about how you're going to respond. Now, I will also say, as we're talking, so we're kind of in this process, I will also say, as we go through this lecture, then another question, so in addition to how we respond to instruction, another question is going to be, that we're going to try to address, is why is it that I stay away from my wife's cakes? Okay, so if you're bored with the first topic, then you can at least gravitate towards the other topic. Okay, you've got both of those things to work with. And so at the end of each of the part, I'll give you a little glimpse of why I stay away from my wife's cakes, which is, it didn't even occur to me. Well, you'll get it as we go through. Okay, so what are some things that kind of draw psychology together? So here are a couple of experiments. I am glad that I've got a laser pointer. I don't know, can you see that? The little red dot, kind of? Okay, all right. So one aspect of psychology is priming. And priming is where you encounter a stimulus, and that stimulus can affect your performance later. Now, it can affect it in a positive way, and it can affect it in a negative way. And so there was some research that was conducted in Well, now I can't say it. There it is. There was some research that was conducted in perception, and individuals were shown this prime, and then they were asked to judge whether these two objects were the same or not. And if the prime matched the object, then you had a fast reaction time. Okay, so you get a prime, and it increases or facilitates your processing. So then in these stimuli, the reaction time was actually longer. So you had a harder time processing that information. Same is true here. So you're presented with this as a prime, and then you have fast processing here. So that's perception. That's kind of my area. I can tell from your faces that you're riveted. So let's move on to cognition. Let's see if I get any other kind of response there. If you're presented with a context word like hand, and then you're presented with the prime palm, then you have to categorize the word wrist, then you have a fast reaction time, 541 milliseconds. If you're presented with the context word hand, and then you're presented with palm, and then the word tree, then you have a slow reaction time. Okay, so if it matches hand, palm, wrist, then you have a fast reaction time. If it doesn't match, then you have a slow reaction time. So similar items can facilitate your perception, can facilitate your ability to kind of process information. Now, where that leads us, so we've got an experiment about cognition, we've got an experiment about perception, and then the next experiment, which I think really kind of opens it up with respect to priming, is social priming. Now, with social priming, the idea is that you encounter information and that affects your social behavior. All right, so we're moving outside of just simple perception, outside of thoughts, and now we're talking about the way we interact with other individuals. All right, so we've got a couple of experiments with social priming. One where we have three groups. Those three groups are presented with words, and they have to create sentences. Now, one group has words that have triggers like the word that kind of activate a schema related to rude. Okay, so blunt. I don't know. Let's see. I think I've got some examples here. So blunt. Disturb, intrude, and then polite, and then there's another group that gets words related to polite. Things like consideration, respect, courteous. And so what we see is when those individuals, so they sit in a laboratory and they have to create these sentences. One group is creating sentences, and all of the words kind of relate to rude, and then the other group, all of the words kind of relate to polite. And what you see is the experimenter looked at, all right, well, when you're done, I need you to come get me. When the person goes to get them, then the experimenter is speaking with someone else, and they go on and talk for like 10 minutes, and what the experiment is all about is what is the likelihood that this person will interrupt? Well, those individuals in the rude condition were more likely to interrupt than those individuals in the polite condition. All right, so, I mean, your mind already should start churning like, all right, well, maybe, if I'm about to interact with somebody, then maybe I need to give them some sentences related to polite, and then they're going to treat me in a polite way, right? There's some real connections here in terms of the way that we interact with others. Another example from the same study is where they had a very similar task. Somebody comes in and they have to write sentences. Well, one of the groups has basically neutral sentences. They're just kind of creating sentences. The other group has sentences that are tied to stereotypical elderly kinds of words. And so they're creating sentences. And then after the experiment, they say, all right, thank you for your participation. We appreciate it. It's over. So they leave, and as they're walking down the corridor, then there is someone sitting at the end of the corridor who is timing them. All right, and they're timing how long it took them to walk down the corridor. And what we see is that those individuals in the neutral condition, it took them a shorter amount of time than those individuals who were in the elderly condition. So the idea is if you prime the idea of elderly, then you walk slower down a corridor. All right. Now, what we see here is we see two different experiments. It's a replication. All right. So we see one experiment, the initial experiment, and then they just basically replicated the experiment and saw the exact same finding. So you see how this kind of starts affecting our perception, our cognition, our social behavior. Now, where that leads us in terms of this talk and kind of where we're going, what we're going to be doing with information, where that leads us is to an uncomfortable place in experimental psychology in about 2011. And so in 2011, one of the things that happened was that, wait a minute, I forgot. I knew I was going to forget something. So I'm about to transition, but before I transition, then I want to make sure that I tell you a story. So we talk about perception, we talk about cognition, we talk about social behavior. Those three things start kind of connecting. Well, how is it that those connect? So my wife and I, we volunteered when we were living in Louisville. We volunteered with a youth group, and so when we were volunteering, we would go Wednesday nights, and we would have small groups, those kinds of things. And one time, my wife said, "Well, I'm going to make some cupcakes for the youth group." Sounds like a great idea. Well, we were living about 45 minutes away, and I said, "Well, being the good husband, I said, why don't I take the cupcakes and I'll take them to my office. That way we've got them in Louisville. You can drive up. We'll go to church and all is well." And she's like, "Okay, that'll be great." So she spends the evening, makes cupcakes, gets them all kind of set up. And I don't know if you're aware of these kinds. So there are cupcake kinds of container things. And so you can basically carry, like one in each hand. And so I was like, all right, so I kind of drive illegally to get as close as I can because I don't want to walk around University of Louisville campus with cupcakes. I just don't want to, okay? I don't want the questions. I don't want the interaction. So I get some of the materials. I take it up to my office, put them in the office, come back down. I grab the cupcakes, immediately turn, and there's a stair right over there. And so I start walking, and about that time I hit the top of the stair, and it's just... And so the cupcakes, so we're talking about connection, so I see all of these cupcakes, the icing on the top of them, just connecting. And it's just a surreal experience to see these things flying out in front of me, and the cupcakes, of course, leave the bottom of the containers and they're floating in midair. It all just seems so slow. So there's the connection part, right? So at the end of the story, everything worked out fine. The kids, it just so happened the kids really don't care, about scrambled up cupcakes. That was the first story. All right, so there's connections. Okay, so when we talk about psychology, we start seeing these exciting connections, but in 2011, then a couple of things happen. One of the things that happens as a social psychologist is it is found out that he has been fabricating data. And so there's one red flag. And then another red flag happens in psychology in 2011 where another prominent psychologist publishes a paper in a prominent journal suggesting that there is precognition, basically suggesting that there is extrasensory perception. And so that's this other alarming aspect. And so this kind of raises this huge red flag in terms of, okay, what are we going to do about these findings? And so the response to that is replication. Okay, so from that, we take a large group of individuals, about 270 psychologists, came together. They grabbed 100 psychological studies and replicated the studies from 3 different journals that were prominent in the area. And so here we have, for some of you, I really like graphs. All right, that's... and I figure I was like, I'm going to have some graphs in there. So what we have here is we have some overview in terms of the experiment. So they took the 100 studies and looked to see how many of the studies replicate. And let's just cut to the chase. What we see is 36% of the replications had significant findings. 36% of the replications had significant findings. Now, at the front end, there were 97% of the original studies had significant findings. We replicate, and now we have 36% of the studies with significant findings. That is alarming. That's real bad. Okay, so on the one hand, it's, and I hesitate saying it's real bad because on the one hand, it's feedback. All right, it's feedback, and that's what science is all about, is replicating and seeing if it holds up. And so in some ways, it's not real bad because we replicate and we try to understand what's going on. But in other cases, you'll want the studies to be well informed and you want them to replicate. And so if we look at this particular graph, then one of the things that we see is, I do want to note that the x-axis has the p-value. So if the probability is low, then that means it's significant, statistically significant. If the probability is greater than 0.05, then we're saying that is not statistically significant. So what we see is probably from chance. We can't rule out chance. So the original study p-value, the highest number there is 0.05. So very few of the studies, the original studies, had p-values greater than 0.05. Like I said, 97% were significant. Now, when we look at the replication p-values, then these range from 0 all the way up to 1. And 0.05 is represented by the dotted line. So anything above the dotted line, all of these points are not statistically significant. Okay, so that is, now the study started in 2011. This was actually published in 2015 with the Open Science collaboration, 270 authors on this publication. Pulling from, again, 3 journals, one from Cognition, one from Psychological Science, and one from Social Psychology. Now, a different look at it is we have the replication effect size and then the original effect size. So when we talk about effect sizes, we're saying what is the relationship between the independent variable and the dependent variable. So the larger the effect size suggests that there is a stronger relationship between these two variables. What we really want in terms of the relationship between the original effect size and the replication effect size, we want all of those values to fall on a single line. And what we see is, and that line is this, this line here. What we see is a large number of studies that have a no effect or a very small effect, which is just kind of restating what we've got here with respect to the p-values. So the original effect sizes are greater than the replication effect size, and that was a significant finding. Now, this is science, and before I get to some of the responses related to this, then this should be a very natural aspect of science, where you conduct a study and then you try to replicate that study, and so that strengthens the discipline. Now, before I go too much further, as I said before, these studies revolved around experimental psychology. They revolved around 3 prominent journals in psychological science. Another study that was recently published in 2018, so we have a long list of authors, many of which coincide with the previous publication. Now, in this case, what you notice is they replicated 21 studies, and if you look down through here, then all of these studies are from Science and Nature. All right, so those are the prominent journals in science. And so all of these studies are Science and Nature, and they involve social science research. So they took studies from 2010 to 2015 and replicated them. Now, I kind of cut to the chase. 62% of the replications had significant findings. So that's better, but these should be kind of the cream of the crop with respect to publication. And then, so 62%, so that's 13 out of 21 ended up replicating. The effect sizes for the original studies, again, significantly larger. What we have here is we have a standardized metric of effect size. So if the effect size is if this is 1, then basically what that's saying is that the effect size for the replication and the effect size for the original are roughly the same. And then, of course, if it's -1, then you got a completely opposite effect for the replication. Now, where does that lead us? Well, one place that leads us is person-wise, and I will say, well, person-wise, if I spent all of my life publishing research and someone came along and replicated my study and didn't find what I found, and then I would be threatened. All right? Academics is one of those institutions where I would like to think that we can just, as a science, we're building up, but there is a reality to it in terms of you really can't, there's a publication bias. Now, the publication bias is this idea that we should publish positive findings when we find something important. And so the last 2 studies emphasize that there is a problem. This produced, as you would guess, some emotional kind of response. You had a group of people who are looking at these studies saying, who feel threatened, who feel like they're personally attacked. I mean, our work in academics, it's our livelihood, all right, and we love it, and we love what we do, and then you have another camp who is saying, they may not, in many of the articles that I read, there is a sensitive nature to it, but there are also some individuals who are saying, you're doing stuff wrong, right? And that's the message that is being portrayed. And so you have these 2 different camps, and so what are you going to do with that kind of feedback? What are you going to do with that information? All right, you've just been told there's an issue. We have not replicated your study. What are you going to do with that information? Now, I ended with social priming because social priming took a hit. And so there were a lot of studies within the area of social priming that did not replicate. And so that was one of the reasons why we kind of left it there. So there are times where we're given feedback. The individuals who did the original study were trying to find novel, unique things, and I believe that. It is, however, also the case that these replications, it isn't necessarily the case that the last experiment was the right experiment, right? And it's not the case that, all of these replications were true, right? Which one's true, which one's false? Well, we've got them on both sides. We've got the original study and we've got a replication study. So we all, it's tough to say that someone was wrong, but it's a matter of moving towards the truth, scientifically moving towards the truth. Now, that leads me to another story, and that is, so my wife made I think it was a baby shower cake. So she made a baby shower cake, and this was a number of years ago. My son was very young, and she probably spent, she spent hours making cakes. And so she made this cake, and then she goes upstairs, and she's going to take our shower. We're about to go to church, and I'm downstairs with my son, and we're playing, having a good time, and what ends up happening, what ends up happening is I say, here's the table, which is lower. Here's the table, and I'm thinking to myself, that cake is awfully close to the edge. It seems close to the edge. And my son is like right there. He's like this tall, and being the husbandly thing to do, I really ought to move that. Really ought to move that cake. And so now a 9 by 13 double layer cake is heavy, if you're not familiar with that. It's heavy, all right? So it's on a board, and I decide in my infinite wisdom that I'm going to take my thumb and I'm going to put my thumb on the board because I don't really want to get anywhere. I remember the cupcake incident. So I don't want to get too close to the cake. So I'm thinking minimal contact, right? So I put my thumb on the board and I push, and about the time where I'm thinking, this is probably a bad idea, my thumb slips, and it goes right into the cake. That's a similar feeling that I feel with respect to the replication crisis, right? So my thumb goes into the cake, and my response, let's face it, I screwed up, right? I was the one who messed the whole thing up, and so I'm angry. I'm angry at myself, but more than anything, I go up and I'm talking to my wife. I'm like, I'm like, I messed up. I just put my thumb to the cake, and she was able to kind of, fix it. I mean, icing is a little like, spackle or something. She fixed it, and everything's fine. Which is, I wouldn't say it was easier than this situation, but the feeling was very similar in terms of, when you read these studies and you put all this effort into something, and then somebody else comes along and says, that's wrong. And some of the individuals who did this, they weren't saying that it was wrong. They're just saying we need to address some of these issues. But it still needs to be addressed. And there is an emotional kind of response to it. Now, what is the response? Well, the immediate response was emotional. All right? You had a lot of people, as I said, who felt threatened, who felt attacked. But there were some very positive things that kind of came out of it. One was questionable research practices. So at least highlighting some of the things that psychologists used to do in terms of not reporting all the conditions, not reporting all of the dependent variables, looking at the data and then making decisions. So some of these were highlighted in terms of practices that continued on and on. Another thing that was highlighted was the file drawer phenomenon. And the file drawer phenomenon was definitely not new, right? So it was published in 1979, and we were aware of it. And it was basically saying that there is this publication bias. If you look at findings in the literature, most of the time those findings are related to positive results. Well, there's a lot of research. Out there. You do a study, you collect the data, you don't find anything. Where does it go? Well, it goes in the file drawer. You can't publish, you can't do anything with it, so you just put it in the file drawer. And so that's a problem. And then finally you have the data detectives. And so I think some of the data detectives is the idea that you can look at the data and you can tell that there's something wrong with it. And so that created some division with respect to those individuals who were threatened and those individuals who were trying to push towards kind of cleaning up the psychological record with respect to experimental psychology. Now, some other positive things that kind of came out of it, pre-registration. So moving forward, how can we improve psychological science and experimental psychology? One aspect is pre-registration. Pre-registration is the idea that you timestamp something. You say, this is what I'm studying, these are my hypotheses, and this is, here's the timestamp. Now, some would contest that kind of binds you, that kind of ties your hands in terms of what you can look at experimentally. And so there is criticism on that side. Another very positive approach is open data, so making sure that things are transparent. So if you do a study, then you can post your data on a particular website, and then others can come along and analyze your data. So being very transparent. The last two are a little bit trickier because there's no consensus in terms of, there's no consensus on, okay, define the right sample size, or define the appropriate level of power, or define the statistical analysis that we need to use. And so those are research specific. So to put a hard and fast rule on those is very difficult. But there's conversation, right? And I think that means a lot. So these suggestions started off as requirements, and that created division. But with the suggestion, then you start seeing those individuals who are threatened saying, it is valuable to replicate. I don't know that it deserves publication, but it is valuable. okay? And then there are those on the other side who say, I see your point about some of the issues with respect to open data. You know, if you can't de-identify the data, then I can see where it would be problematic to make it all available. Now, all of this has started to trickle down, and replication through pedagogy, which is something that is near and dear to my heart, and that's the idea that now, when it's time to replicate, we can use undergraduate students and graduate students to help in the replication process, to build a better base, to build better bricks, to build better buildings with respect to research. And I think that's an exciting part where undergraduate researchers, there are a lot of undergraduate psychology students, a lot of undergraduate students who do undergraduate research their junior year, their senior year, and they take the data and they don't do anything with it. I mean, maybe there's a poster, but a lot of times you just collect the data and then it kind of goes to the wayside. And so CREP, or the Collaborative Replication Education Project, is making an effort to take some of that data and say, all right, well, you know, if we get a couple of students here and a couple of students here and a couple of students here, and each of them collect data on 45 or 50 people, that can be a powerful study. And so there are efforts to increase, using undergraduates to increase the replication and improve this kind of initiative with respect to experimental psychology. So the last two slides, how we respond, I think I'm encouraged because we're doing something with the feedback. Right? And when we see the replication, we see the issue, and now we're actually doing something with it. Which leads me to my last story, and the last story that I have is also kind of in relation to a response, or in relation to how you respond. So my wife made a couple of wedding cakes, and she made them at home, and so it was at that point where we were going to, she made them for her sister's wedding, and so we were going to, she lives 7 hours away, so pack up, put the wedding cakes in, I think they were in a cooler maybe, in the trunk, and we're off, and so we get about halfway, 3 hours into the trip, I get out, put gas into the car and get back into the car, and she's like, my wife turns to me, she's like, what's that smell? Now let me just go ahead and tell you this. I am terrible with smells. I can't smell anything. When the kids were real little, like infants, I would take them, like turn them around and be like, no, it's good. Fine. So my sniffer is not the best at all. And so I get into the car, I'm like, I don't smell anything. I think we're all right. And she's like, I think I smell gas. I was like, maybe I stepped in gas while I was out there. I don't know. Yeah, I smell gas. And I was like, okay, well, sorry, I stepped in gas. Right? I mean, we were at a gas station. I stepped in gas. And so she was like, no, I've got wedding cakes that I made, and I don't want them to smell like gas. Well, what do you want me to do? And so there was some tension there. And I was like, well, what do you want me to throw my shoes out the window? And I got this look like. Now, I did get to keep my shoes, thankfully. Although there was some question involved. And the wedding cakes turned out fine because she was concerned that gas smell would kind of permeate. I mean, that just really messes up a whole wedding whenever your wedding cake smells like gas. But in terms of response, doing something about it, right? And so with respect to experimental psychology, we have some really exciting initiatives kind of moving forward from that. And so as we conclude, then, I teach, right? And so as I teach, then we start off and we end up hopefully at the same point. And so how do you respond? How do you respond to instruction? Nobody likes to be told they're wrong. Nobody likes to be told they're wrong. But how are you going to respond whenever you're provided with that information? Thank you for your time.
So as usual, we have payment in plaque, which is, if you really want to buy this, I'm guessing he'll sell it later on eBay today. But great appreciation today. I do understand a little bit from that talk why it is that Kevin made me, for an hour before this, he made me write things with superlatives like best ever and most stupendous and fantastic. So I will say without any question that was the finest, most elegant, most remarkable, exceptional connection between psychological research and cake that I have ever heard. So thank you, Kevin, and please join me in thanking Kevin once again. You can go.